Hello and welcome along. So I'm almost at the end of my series on the legions before they met their Primarchs. So I thought it'd be a nice fun video to do to look at the impact that each Primarch had on their legion and give a judgment on whether it was positive or negative. So I'm going to give them a rating from extremely negative, negative, neutral, positive, extremely positive. I'm just going to do it off the top of my head, so let's see how it goes. So first of all, Horus. Well, Horus had a very big impact on the Lunar Wolves. He took them right to the top. You know, he made them one of the perhaps the most prestigious legion to be in because of his close relationship with the Emperor, because of his position as the numero uno, number one son. I have to say, very positive. He also improved them in militarily, although they were very effective before he was reunited with them anyway. He took them up to another level. He made them into essentially an unstoppable force and one of the most powerful legions in the Imperium. But to be fair, they were already a very effective force and were already well favoured within the Imperium. So I'm going to give him positive effect for Horus. So, number 2, Leman Russ. Well, I have to say, despite my dislike for Leman Russ, he had a very positive impact on the Space Wolves. Without him, they would have been purged within probably a decade. I mean, he completely saved them. Would they have turned to chaos at some point? Potentially, but probably not, because it was just too early for that to happen. So probably they would have just become renegades, purged by the Imperium for being too uncontrollable, too violent, too reckless, killing way too many civilians, and constantly infighting. But with his reforms, they were turned into a very effective force, and one that became relatively respected, although always on the edge of the kind of brotherhood of legions. I mean, they weren't particularly favoured by the other legions. Well, in fact, they were quite unpopular, but at least they survived with him. Without him, I can't see them surviving very long. Ferrus, Manus, and the Iron Hands. Ooh. So, the Iron Hands were a very impressive legion before Ferrus took over, and they were well respected. They were doing a good job. They were highly effective. And after he took over, they did develop this obsession with the machine and excluding the flesh, which he never really seemed to be on board with. Yet it was a response to him taking over the Legion that kind of drove that. He also was prone to his bouts of temper. He didn't really show any real care to his legionaries, which did create a very dark kind of undercurrent within the Legion. They loved him, but they were all very bitter and kind of difficult people. Well, not all of them, but there was this very strong current within the Legion that seems to stem from his personality, the way he treated them when he was in charge of the Legion. So I don't think you can say he had a very positive impact on them. I would say neutral. I don't think he elevated them to new heights or saved them from some terrible fate like some of the other legions. So I'm going to go neutral. Fulgrim and the Emperor's Children. Well, Fulgrim, I think, it has to be very positive. Without Fulgrim, the Emperor's Children would have died out. Because of the problem with their gene seed being contaminated by a virus, they were dying out. And it was only by being reunited with Fulgrim that they were able to be restored. There were very few of them left by the time he was found, and they were going to fade out and disappear. So, although they were very well respected, they were effective before he came along. They were just not able to survive without him. They would have just disappeared. So, it has to go down as a very positive impact. He also, of course, had a good impact militarily and organizational wise and prestige wise. He was very respected Primarch, and he was a very talented leader. So he had entirely a positive impact on them, as well as completely saving them from non-existence. So it has to go down as a very positive impact. So Vulkan and the Salamanders. Well, positive, I think, because again, they were an effective legion before he came along, but they were without a sort of a guiding principle, a code that he gave them. So he was quite an inspirational leader and one of the most balanced mentally of all the Primarchs, certainly the most ethical of all the Primarchs. So he gave them this code that elevated them in many ways above the other legions, in terms of their conduct, and perhaps stopped them from going down a path towards too much savagery, which could potentially have led them into disaster in the future. But it's hard to say that it was a very positive impact, because I think they're already on a reasonable lines. So I would say positive impact for Vulkan. So Rogal, Dorn, and the Imperial Fists. Well, the Imperial Fists were, they were doing their thing. They were doing a good job. They were well respected. They were effective. They were, in many ways, one of the most effective of the legions at that time. I think when Dorn came along, he just added a Primarch to an already very functional and effective legion. He didn't really raise this prestige or their level of respect within the Imperium as such, because they were already pretty well respected, and he wasn't the most flashy or charismatic of people, so he didn't really lift them in that sense. I'm going to say neutral. Nothing really changed, and they just carried on doing what they did. So Guilliman and the Ultramarines, well, it's similar to the Imperial Fists in that they were already doing impressive things. They were pretty big. They were well organized. They were effective. Although unlike the Imperial Fists, the Ultramarines had a huge military disaster in their past, and they did have a bit of a tarnish on their reputation because of that. And Guilliman did elevate them beyond that. He took them to a whole nother level, and because of the infrastructure, the organization that he'd already created in Ultramar, it allowed the Ultramarines to grow to their enormous size that they eventually did. So I think I'm going to give him a positive impact. Not very positive, because again, he didn't save them from any terrible fate, but he did elevate them beyond what they were when he got them by quite a large amount. So that's why I'm going to say positive. So Magnus the Red and the Thousand Sons. Well, it has to be very positive, because without Magnus, again, they would have disappeared. Like Emperor's Children with Fulgrim, without Magnus to save the Thousand Sons, they were going to go extinct. There were less than 1,000 of them left when he was reunited with them. The flesh change was taking them on an increasingly regular basis, and they would just not exist anymore. On top of that, he massively elevated their potential as a legion based on psychers. He introduced the cult system, the training of psychers, and of course he spread that through the Imperium with the Librarius. So not only did he save them from a terrible fate, he also elevated their effectiveness considerably. So it can only be a very positive impact. Sanguinius and the Blood Angels, well, definitely very positive. So another legion that, like the Space Wolves, that were on the path to essentially being purged by the Imperium. They were going to be renegade. They were ravaging lunatics who were drinking people's blood, drinking each other's blood, and not always consensually. They were doing all sorts of things. They were regularly going too far, killing civilians, wiping out large numbers of civilians, just completely losing control of themselves. They were essentially turning into vampires without Sanguinius to take control of them, instigate some form of order, some sort of code of behavior. They were going to be lost very soon. And again, not only did he save them from that fate, he elevated them up to being one of the most effective and most prestigious legions within the Imperium. So he completely reversed their fates, and so a very positive impact. So the Lion and the Dark Angels. Ooh, this is an interesting one. I'm gonna say he had a negative impact on them. That's gonna be a little bit hard to take for some of you, I know, but I just think the Dark Angels, they were already incredibly prestigious. They were literally the first legion of the Imperium, and they were in effect the first legion. They were the most important legion for the early part of their history. Now, they did have a huge military disaster before the Lion joined them, and he helped to bring them back up to another level, but he then kind of took their reputation back down again a bit, quite a lot, with the disasters of the Rangdan genocide. He also introduced the culture of Caliban into the Legion, which really created this kind of deep underlying mistrust between the various elements within the Legion. He treated his legionaries quite poorly, and in a way that made them doubt themselves and not really know what they were supposed to do, what was good, what was to be expected of them. So although he's by no means anywhere near the worst Primarch for what the effect he has on his legion, I don't think it's fair to say that he had a positive effect on them. So I'm going to say negative. Perturabo and the Iron Warriors. Ooh, right, so the Iron Warriors were a very capable, effective, and large legion before Perturabo took over. And he did, in many ways, keep that going. He expanded them. They were very successful under his leadership, but his personality was so warped, so damaged. He made the Legion very divided and bitter, and very much played into the victim role that he felt that he was, this victim of being overlooked all the time. And to be fair, he was overlooked, but he made it so much worse for himself than it needed to be, which made it worse for the Legion than it needed to be. He really had no care at all for their lives. I mean, when he first took over, he decimated them. I mean, literally decimated. So 1 in 10 were killed by the others. He constantly lost his temper and killed people. He treated them quite poorly. You could say he was quite an abusive leader. But so he has to. I think you have to be negative. I'm not going to say very negative, because they still were very successful, even with his brutal leadership. They were very successful, and they didn't suffer some terrible fate. He didn't do anything that was extremely disastrous. So I suppose you could say they lived a very difficult life, balanced on the edge of pleasing him or not. But if you managed to survive in the Iron Warriors, you were still going to be probably on the winning side. So that's got to be worth something. So I'm going to say negative, but not very negative. So Mortarion and the Death Guard. Again, Death Guard, very successful before Mortarion took over. Big, effective, respected. And with Mortarion, they basically remained the same. I mean, they didn't get any worse, but they didn't get any better, really. I mean, he didn't really add much. I mean, the thing about Mortarion is he's kind of bland in many ways. It's quite an interesting idea for a character, but he never really goes anywhere. He obviously deeply twisted and bitter person, yet somehow he didn't really come out that much with the way he treated his legion until the heresy. So I don't think I would say negative. I'm going to say neutral. They just kept doing what they always did. They did take quite a lot of casualties during warfare with him as the leader, but they did that before anyway. This is the way they fought. They just liked to walk across a battlefield getting shot and just falling over and getting back up again. That's what they did. So I'm going to say neutral. I'm surprised myself there. Lorgar and the Word Bearers. Well, definitely negative. How negative? So the Word Bearers before Lorgar were a pretty good legion. They were doing good things. They were pretty big. They were pretty effective. They'd won a lot of battles. They were actually reasonably well liked within the Imperium, and generally a good legion, to be honest. But with Lorgar taking over, he introduced his obsession with the Emperor, his heretical belief the Emperor was a god, which he infested the legion with, and which led to the legion becoming more and more disrespected by people within the Imperium, by the other legions, and of course getting them in trouble with the Emperor himself, eventually leading to the humiliation on Monarchia, where they were publicly disciplined by the Emperor and the Ultramarines. And that all stemmed from Lorgar introducing the Emperor worship into the Legion, and the culture of his homeworld was very deeply religious, and he himself was a deeply spiritual person. It was just a massive clash with the Imperial truth, and the Legion bore the brunt of that. Also, of course, he was not a very effective general. He was not a very effective individual fighter. He was a little bit of an embarrassment to the Legion in many ways. And so his effect on the Legion was pretty much unanimously negative. And they would have almost certainly been better off without him. That seems pretty harsh on Lorgar, but I can't think of anything positive he brought to the Legion, to be honest. Yeah, so in summary, very negative. The Khan and the White Scars. Well, so the White Scars were very fragmented before the Khan took over. Very fragmented. They were kind of disappearing as a legion because they just couldn't keep up with the losses of casualties. They were so spread out, so disorganized in their logistics that they were just fading away. They didn't suffer any great problem with their gene seed as such, so they weren't struggling to successfully create new Astartes. They just were always so far ahead of logistics that they couldn't keep up the recruitment process to match the losses. And so they were slowly degrading their numbers. And they were becoming very different from each other, very distant. And the small groups they were operating in were becoming very separate culturally. And so they were kind of losing their identity as a legion anyway. So I think what the Khan did, bringing them all back together, giving them a shared identity, giving them a home world with a logistics system, although that's not his strong point, that at least enough to get their numbers back up to a reasonable sort of legion size, was a positive impact. And in warfare, he did elevate them again to another level, although his type of warfare was very similar to theirs anyway. They were successful in fighting. They were very well respected. Not that he took an unsuccessful legion and made them successful. It's just that he united them and he got them back on track to being an actual legion. So I'm going to give him positive impact. Conrad, Curze, and the Night Lords. Well, I suppose it's got to be negative. I mean, maybe even very negative. So the Night Lords before Curze were very successful. They were renowned for doing some pretty terrible things, but they did those terrible things for the greater good, I suppose you could argue. They did them as a tactic to win wars, to kill a relatively small number of people in a terrible way so that a much larger number of people would surrender. That was their purpose. That's what they were created to do by the Emperor, and they were doing that well. Then with Curze, his constant madness, his inability to see reality, well, I suppose to see too much of reality, perhaps, if you put it that way, that drove him insane, led him to do many stupid things. And also the fact that they were recruiting from his home world, Nostromo, where they were all like him. I mean, they were all severely mentally damaged by the terrible conditions that they were living in. Now, that's not unusual for Space Marine recruits, to be fair. So it's not really an excuse. But theirs was particularly bad, and without a good system to create good recruits out of these people that were living in this terrible society where they were literally children eating each other to survive, then it was inevitably going to lead to a legion that had a lot of people within it who were extremely untrustworthy and were prone to turn on each other at the drop of a hat. So I have to say, yes, so Conrad Curze, I'm going to say very negative. Angron and the World Eaters, well, I suppose this doesn't take too much thought. It has to be very negative. I mean, the World Eaters before Angron were not doing great, though, to be fair. They were already on a path to probably being purged by the Imperium. But Angron, when he joined them, did nothing to change that. He increased the chances of that happening by introducing the Butcher's Nails. Now, I think although they were prone to these bouts of loss of control, etc., they weren't doing that bad. They were managing to just about keep it in check enough to stay as a useful sort of necessary evil within the Imperium. They were less likely to go renegade than, say, the Blood Angels or the Space Wolves were for their losses of control. And the Imperium is willing to accept quite a lot of civilian casualties if you get the job done. So, and I think in the case of the World Eaters, they were just about on the right side of that line. So without Angron, I think they would have been okay, actually. Just about. I mean, they were certainly walking in a very narrow path. But I'm going to say Angron, therefore, had only negative effects on them. So it has to be very negative. Very negative for Angron. That's not much of a surprise, really, is it? Now, of course, the 2nd and 11th Primarchs, we don't know. I mean, all we can say is that they got their legions purged somehow, and it does seem to be, from the tiny little hints of what you can gather, that it was more their actions than their legions' actions. So on that basis, you have to say both very negative. I think that's fair, based on what we know. Maybe we'll know more in the future. But at the moment, I have to put it both down as very negative. Corax and the Raven Guard. That is an interesting one. Well, the Raven Guard, they were very effective before. They were very closely linked with Horus, a lot like the White Scars, before their Primarch came along. But they were doing reasonably well. They were quite small, though. They were very small as a legion and more of just a kind of a special forces unit within the Lunar Wolves in many ways. They were like a separate, like a large chapter that operated so closely with the Lunar Wolves that it was hard to distinguish them. But they were very effective, very, very impressive. They were much more they were much more ethically ambiguous before Corax came along. So he certainly instilled in them a higher level of ethical standards. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing in the 40k universe is hard to say, because it probably gets you killed. He did increase their size significantly when he took over. He gave them a home world with some effective infrastructure the Legion was able to use to get much bigger, become more of a balanced force, use more heavier weapons and so on. But that's not necessarily any positive impact in itself. I mean, they were doing really well under Horus as a special unit that he could call upon when he needed them to do some stabby stuff in the dark. And in many ways, they were more at the center of things when they were Horus's helpers than when they were under Corax, who was so far on the edge of like Primarch society that he was just kind of ignored. That's just a tough one, isn't it? I'm going to say neutral. I think I'm going to give him a neutral effect. Okay, and Alpharius Amagon. This is the last one, and the Alpha Legion, of course. Well, I don't know, because I don't know what happened. And nor do you. So, yeah, watch my video on the history of the Alpha Legion before their Primarch if you want to know more details of the various ideas that could have happened and could not have happened, or did happen and didn't happen. Now let's go with what probably happened and therefore what the impact was. I'm going to say I don't know. Okay, nobody knows. I'm going to go neutral because it's just impossible to tell what impact he has. Was he ever not there? Was he there? If he was there, did he change them, or that's exactly how they were? They seems like they were always like that. He had no impact at all. But of course, having a Primarch within your midst is going to be beneficial, but it doesn't seem to have changed the way that they were viewed by other people or how effective they were at doing their job. So who knows? Maybe it never changed because he was never absent. Maybe it never changed because he was just so intrinsically similar to them that you would never notice any change, or because his whole MO was to hide within the Legion, so you wouldn't ever really see him change them or lift them in any way. Maybe it's because they didn't really need any help. They were already just so effective and so perfect for the job that they had that was just the way it was. And so there was nothing he could really do to change that. Okay, neutral. So there you go. That is my opinions on the impacts that each Primarch had on their legions after being reunited with them. I'm sure there's much for you to disagree with in there, but let me know in the comments. It'd be really interesting to see what you think. So thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe and share,